the Black Death. Imagine yourself walking down a bustling medieval street. The air is thick with the mingled scents of fresh bread baking at the corner, farm animals tethered nearby, and, if you're honest, a not so pleasant undercurrent of waste and sweat. Vendors shout to sell their goods, horses clip-clop by in muddy roads, and townsfolk jostle for space in cramped, narrow lanes. Now imagine the chatter suddenly turns to whispers, growing steadily more urgent and fearful. The plague is coming. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least it's not your morning traffic jam, right? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Wherever you are in the world, go ahead and drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's like we're all gathering around the same campfire, telling stories from different corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1347. Europe is a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies and city-states, teeming with life and the noises of everyday hustle and bustle. Across the Mediterranean Sea, a flotilla of Genoese trading ships arrives at the Sicilian port of Messina. The crews are sick, many dead, and the ships carry an invisible and deadly cargo. Unbeknownst to anyone at the time, the Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, has just landed on European shores. This tiny bacterium hitches a ride on fleas, which themselves feast on black rats nesting inside the ship's dark, creaky timbers. You might scoff at rats today, but back then, they were an unavoidable part of life. Cities and towns had no pest control, and rats flourished amid piles of rubbish and food scraps. They were as common as pigeons or street dogs. The rats were unwitting carriers, but it was the fleas that were the real villains, jumping from rats to humans, injecting the deadly bacteria with every bite. You can picture the flea as a tiny assassin, invisible to the naked eye, carrying death in its jaws. Once the infected rats died, which they did quickly, the fleas jumped onto humans, spreading the infection further. This arrival of the plague was like a wave crashing down on Europe. The disease moved swiftly, racing along trade routes, on ships, in carts, and by foot. Coastal towns were the first to fall ill. In Sicily, people died within days of the ship's arrival. The disease didn't stay put. It spread northwards into Italy, France, and beyond. Within a year it had reached England, and within a few more most of Europe was infected. You probably imagine disease spreading in those times was slow, but the Black Death was anything but. It tore through cities and countryside alike with terrifying speed. Imagine trying to outrun a sickness that could kill you in days, with no idea how it spread or how to stop it. Historians still argue whether the initial spread was mainly caused by the rat-flea-human chain, or if human-to-human transmission through coughing and sneezing played a larger role, especially in dense urban areas. Some even suggest the plague had multiple forms, including a pneumonic version that attacked the lungs and spread through respiratory droplets, making it terrifyingly contagious. Before the plague arrived, life in medieval Europe was a mixture of hope, hardship, and fragile normalcy. Towns were growing quickly, markets thrived, and trade routes connected distant lands. Yet cities were crowded and filthy by today's standards. Imagine narrow, twisting streets clogged with garbage, animals wandering freely, and human waste dumped in open gutters or even streets. Sanitation was almost non-existent, and the smell... well, let's just say your nose would be in for a rude awakening. Medieval medicine was, at best, a guessing game. Doctors believed disease could be caused by miasma, bad air, or imbalances in the body's four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Treatments included bloodletting, herbal remedies, and for the truly desperate, some rather strange cures. Believe it or not, one popular treatment involved applying a poultice made from crocodile dung to buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that blackened the skin. You can almost hear the sceptical groans of anyone subjected to this therapy. But there was no cure for the Black Death. It was a force of nature sweeping across the continent with a grim determination that no prayers or potions could halt. When the plague struck, Symptoms were gruesome and swift. People first developed high fever, chills, and weakness. Then the hallmark buboes appeared, large blackish swellings, often the size of eggs, under the armpits, in the groin, or on the neck. The skin around them darkened, giving the disease its chilling nickname. In many cases, the infection would enter the bloodstream, causing septicemia, which led to bleeding under the skin and even more terrifying black patches. Imagine the terror of seeing friends, family and neighbours shrivel and die within days, sometimes hours. The disease was ruthless, killing an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population in just a few years. And it didn't discriminate. Nobles and peasants, kings and servants, all were vulnerable. Some royal families were nearly wiped out, while entire villages were abandoned. The scale of death was so massive that it shook medieval society to its core. A quirky yet grim tidbit is that in some places people believed cats were to blame, thinking they were witches' familiars spreading evil. This led to mass killings of cats, which ironically may have worsened the plague since fewer cats meant more rats. It's a classic example of misunderstanding and panic making things worse, a lesson we still learn today. Meanwhile, some people thought the plague was divine punishment for humanity's sins. This belief led to public acts of penance, like flagellants whipping themselves in procession, hoping to appease God. Historians still argue whether these acts helped spread the disease further or provided some psychological relief to desperate communities. In just a short time, the Black Death transformed Europe. Towns emptied, markets closed, and the social order began to unravel. People abandoned farms and fled cities, cemeteries overflowed with the dead, and fear permeated every corner of life. What you're about to follow is not just a tale of death, but a story of survival, change, and how a microscopic organism reshaped the world forever. So now that we've set the stage, let's step back and take a deeper look at the world just before the plague arrived. Imagine a medieval town in Europe, bustling with activity. Merchants shouting their wares, children running through narrow alleys, and the clink of blacksmiths hammering away at their anvils. The streets are full of life, but it's also full of dangers, most of which you can't see. The people around you are living in a world where survival is a constant struggle. Disease, famine, war, and poverty are all too familiar companions. Now let's talk about the everyday life of the people who would soon be struck down by the Black Death. Medieval Europe was primarily agricultural. Most people lived and worked on farms, growing food for themselves and the growing towns. Feudalism was the system that governed the land. Lords owned the land, and peasants worked it in exchange for protection. This was a time of relative stability for some, especially the landowners, who controlled the wealth. But for the vast majority, the peasants, the labourers, the townsfolk, it was a life of hard work, little reward, and a constant struggle against the elements. The majority of people lived in small villages or towns, often overcrowded and dirty. Homes were built close together, sometimes sharing walls. Sanitation was primitive at best. Streets were often filled with waste, animal droppings, and the stink of decay. The air wasn't exactly fresh, and your windows didn't open to let in a breeze. In fact, medieval homes didn't even have glass in the windows. Instead, they had wooden shutters, which meant there was little ventilation. So when the plague arrived, it found a fertile environment to take root. In the cities, life was equally grim. The medieval towns were tightly packed with people. Think of something like a maze of narrow, winding streets with buildings crowded together, and every corner seemed to house some sort of market stall where traders sold anything from bread and cheese to leather and wool. It was a far cry from the grand urban centres of today, unsanitary, overcrowded and poor. In fact, the life expectancy for most people was only around 30 years, and many died before they could ever enjoy their prime. Medical knowledge at the time wasn't much help either. Doctors were few and far between, and their understanding of disease was limited. In fact, the very concept of germs and bacteria didn't exist yet. Instead, people believed in the theory of the four humours, which was based on the idea that the body's health depended on a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When someone got sick, the treatment was often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting was common, where doctors would literally cut a patient and let blood out, thinking it would restore balance. Or they'd use leeches. Those weren't just for fun, but part of a standard treatment regimen. It was in this environment, one already ripe with disease, filth, and a fragile social structure, that the plague would take hold and spread like wildfire. As soon as the first signs of illness began to show in Messina, Sicily, panic started to spread as quickly as the plague itself. People began to flee, not knowing what they were running from, thinking they could escape fate. But the plague, with its swift and deadly nature, wasn't so easily outrun. The question still lingers: why did it spread so fast? Historians still argue whether it was primarily the rats and fleas that did the dirty work, or if human-to-human transmission was equally responsible, especially in crowded, unsanitary urban areas. It's likely that both factors contributed to the rapid spread of the disease, making it almost impossible to escape once it took hold. But let's pause for a moment and think about how this disease could just turn the world upside down. You're living in a time of relative hardship, yes, but also routine. You wake up, you go to work, you're part of a tight-knit community. Life may not be easy, but it's predictable. Then, without warning, everything changes. You can't trust your body. You can't trust your neighbours. The very air you breathe could be carrying death. Your world crumbles beneath your feet, and everything you once knew about survival is now in question. And the worst part, there's no escape, no cure, no hope, just fear. For the nobles, the rich and the powerful, the plague was an equalizer. They had the best homes, the best food, and the most comfortable lives, but they were still just as vulnerable as the poorest peasant. And that's one of the most shocking things about the Black Death. It didn't care who you were. You could be royalty or a beggar, it didn't matter. The disease swept through both classes without prejudice. The rich were hit just as hard as the poor. Some royalty were wiped out in the blink of an eye, leaving entire countries in chaos as leaders died without successors. And that's when you really start to grasp the scale of the catastrophe. You've lived through plagues before, perhaps, and the fear is always present. But this was different. The Black Death wasn't just another disease, it was an unstoppable force that rewrote the rules of medieval Europe. Towns emptied, castles and estates were abandoned, and death became a constant looming companion. It was the end of an era, and in its wake, it left a world unrecognisable from the one that had existed just months before. This sudden and dramatic change was not just a physical one, it was also psychological. People didn't know what to think or who to trust. Some turned to religion, others to superstitions, and still, others simply gave in to despair. The sense of chaos and collapse spread with the plague itself, and people began to question everything they had once believed. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed faith, it killed order, and it killed the very fabric of medieval society. And yet, in the aftermath, something incredible happened. The Black Death, despite its overwhelming destruction, also set the stage for one of the most profound transformations in European history. Power shifted. The economic balance of the continent was forever altered. The labour force became scarce, giving surviving workers leverage they had never had before. New opportunities arose from the ashes of the old world, though the price for such change was, of course, steep. The Black Death was a true turning point. But before we rush ahead, let's take a moment to understand how this disease actually worked, how it spread, and how it would transform the lives of the millions of people who would come face to face with it. Now that we've set the stage and begun to feel the weight of the plague's arrival, it's time to take a closer look at how the disease spread so rapidly, like an unstoppable wave crashing against a defenceless shore. Imagine the scene: bustling medieval trade routes, crowded marketplaces, and people living in close quarters. That's where the Black Death would make its move. It's no surprise that the plague spread so quickly. The medieval world, though vibrant and full of life, was also a breeding ground for disease. Travel and trade had increased across Europe, Asia and Africa. Merchants from the east brought goods, spices, silks, and other treasures. But they also brought something far deadlier: disease. The plague wasn't something that could be contained by borders or coastlines, and it didn't take long for it to spread beyond its initial entry point in Messina, Sicily. Trade routes, like the infamous Silk Road, had already been established for centuries, connecting distant lands across Asia and into Europe. In fact, the plague followed these trade paths, crossing cities, villages and regions with terrifying speed. Imagine a line of caravans winding their way from the east, bringing goods and also carrying death in the form of infected fleas and rats, hidden away in the dark corners of the merchant caravans, the ships, and even the clothing of travellers. It's almost as if the plague had its own hidden map, weaving its way through Europe, leaping from town to town, village to village, until the entire continent was caught in its grip. But the real reason it spread so quickly wasn't just the physical movement of people and goods. The environmental conditions of medieval Europe, along with the unsanitary conditions in cities and towns, made the perfect environment for the disease to thrive. The streets were overcrowded and people lived in close proximity, often in houses that were little more than huts. There were no modern sewer systems, and waste often piled up on the streets or in the open air. People didn't have the faintest idea about germs or how disease spread, so they lived in close quarters, breathing the same air, sharing food, and working side by side without any understanding of how dangerous it could be. Historians still argue whether the disease spread primarily through the rat-flea-human cycle, or if human-to-human transmission played a bigger role. There's no definitive answer. While rats were certainly a key factor, and the fleas that lived on them were the primary carriers, it's highly likely that coughing, sneezing, and close contact allowed the plague to spread from person to person as well. The plague was highly contagious, and once it reached a densely populated area, it had no trouble finding new hosts. By the time the plague hit urban centres, it had already been carried to remote villages and across open plains. When it arrived in larger cities like Florence, Paris, and London, it exploded. Markets, inns, homes, everywhere you turned, someone was dying or already dead. It wasn't just that the disease killed people quickly, it was the sheer volume of victims that made it feel like the world was crumbling. Thousands of people were struck down each day, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. One particularly interesting and gruesome aspect of the plague was its speed. It's hard to imagine today, but people often went from perfectly healthy to dead in just a few days. The first signs were often fever, chills, and body aches. Then came the characteristic buboes, swollen, painful lymph nodes that would turn black and ooze pus. The pain was intense, and for many it was too much to endure. Some victims died so quickly that there was no time to say goodbye to their families, and the bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Even more terrifying for the medieval world at the time was the fact that no one knew what was happening. There was no concept of viruses or bacteria. Instead, people believed in miasma, the idea that bad air or vapours caused illness. And so, some people tried to escape the plague by running away, but the disease moved faster than they could, carried on the wind, and by the fleas that jumped onto anyone who dared step outside their door. The panic that ensued was as deadly as the disease itself. Whole communities were abandoned. Families turned on each other, with some abandoning their sick loved ones in the streets to fend for themselves. Death was everywhere. There was no escape. In some places, people turned to religious explanations, believing the plague was God's punishment for sin. Others believed in more superstitious explanations, blaming witches or evil spirits. It was a time of confusion and fear, and the plague made no distinctions between the poor or the rich, the noble or the peasant. What's remarkable, and perhaps a little strange, is that the world's response to the plague was so varied, often desperate and bizarre. People in the hardest hit areas often resorted to extreme measures to try to stop the plague. There were public flagellations where people would whip themselves in the streets to atone for their sins, hoping that God would spare them. In some places, these flagellants became so numerous that they formed bands and marched from town to town, drawing crowds wherever they went. Meanwhile, doctors, most of whom had no idea how to treat the plague, started wearing strange beak-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, convinced that the foul odours around them were causing the illness. It's eerie to think that these bizarre rituals and the constant fear of death were part of the daily experience of millions of people. And still, despite the panic, there was no escape. The plague simply couldn't be outrun. The death toll was staggering, with entire communities wiped out in the span of weeks. It is believed that in some places up to 60% of the population was lost. Imagine living through a time when half the people you knew were dead in a matter of months. You could walk down a street and where once there were homes full of people, now there was nothing but empty buildings and the smell of decay. Historians have long debated what role the environment played in all of this. The Little Ice Age, a period of cooler temperatures in Europe, had begun just a few decades before the plague hit, and many believe that this cooler climate contributed to the spread of the disease. The colder temperatures may have allowed the fleas and rats to thrive longer than they otherwise would have, giving the plague an added advantage. Historians still argue whether this was a primary factor or merely a coincidence, but it's clear that the environment, along with the lack of understanding of how disease spread, made the perfect storm for the Black Death to wreak havoc. As you can see, the spread of the Black Death was more than just the movement of rats and fleas. It was a combination of human actions, environmental conditions, and an utter lack of medical knowledge that allowed this killer to spread so efficiently. But we're not done yet. The next chapter in our journey is where we'll begin to feel the full impact of the plague. It's one thing to watch death spread across the land, but it's something else entirely to live through the collapse of entire cities, communities, and social structures. So we've discussed how the plague arrived and how it spread with terrifying speed across the land. Now let's turn our attention to something just as horrific, what it felt like to be struck by the Black Death. Imagine for a moment that you're standing in the midst of an outbreak. The air feels different, thicker, almost oppressive. The streets are filled with people going about their business, but there's an underlying current of panic. You might feel an odd twinge in your body, a sudden headache, chills, a deep fatigue. It's just a little bit off, but in this time, you know that any small sign of illness could be a death sentence. The first symptoms of the plague usually began with a fever, chills, and severe body aches. People felt like they had been hit by a freight train. You're weak, nauseous, and everything hurts. But it doesn't stop there. Within hours or days, the real horror begins. The classic symptom that became the hallmark of the disease were the buboes, large, painful, swollen lymph nodes that appeared in the armpits, groin, or neck. The skin around these lumps turned black as the infection spread, and they oozed pus and blood. The term Black Death comes from the dark, mottled skin that developed around the buboes, a chilling sign of the disease's grip. Historians still argue over the exact causes of the symptoms and the mechanisms by which the plague worked. Was it septicemic plague, where the bacteria spread rapidly through the bloodstream? Or was it more of a bubonic form where the disease concentrated in the lymph nodes? Some researchers even suggest that the high fever and rapid onset of death point to a combination of these forms. What is clear, though, is that it wasn't just the physical toll, it was the psychological impact of knowing that there was no hope. Imagine the feeling of helplessness. You know that this disease doesn't spare anyone, rich or poor, young or old. It moves fast and there's nothing to stop it. You might have seen it take your friends or family members in just a matter of days. Some people believed they could outrun it, fleeing their homes or retreating to the countryside. But the plague was relentless. It wasn't a disease you could escape by simply running away. Even the fastest riders, the most determined travellers, couldn't outrun it. For many, the plague's rapid progression meant that there was no time for reflection, no time to prepare. One day, you might feel just a little bit under the weather, and within days you could be dead. Some sources tell of entire families wiped out, often with no time for burial, leaving their loved ones to rot in the streets. Towns and villages were abandoned as the death toll mounted, and cemeteries quickly filled to capacity. Entire fields lay fallow as workers died off, and production slowed to a halt. The physical and emotional toll was staggering. Now think of the fear that gripped entire towns and communities. Once the plague entered a city or village, It often took only days before the situation became dire. There was no warning, no certainty about who would survive. People began to turn on each other. Families abandoned their sick, afraid that they too would become infected. Towns shut their gates and tried to isolate themselves from the rest of the world, hoping that somehow they could stop the plague's advance. But the disease didn't care. It didn't matter where you were. It moved with the wind, carried by fleas or by human contact, and soon it would find you. In places where the disease took its greatest toll, entire neighbourhoods would be depopulated. You could walk down a street once bustling with life, and now find nothing but empty homes, the occasional body lying discarded in the streets. In some areas, people didn't even have time to bury the dead properly, leaving bodies to rot in open fields. It's a level of chaos and despair that's difficult to imagine, but it's the reality that people in medieval Europe had to face. And yet, in the midst of this suffering, something strange began to happen. The medical establishment, if you could call it that, scrambled to find solutions. However, they had no idea how to treat the plague. Some of the treatments were bizarre, even by today's standards. Doctors, many of whom were more superstition-driven than science-driven, turned to concoctions of herbs and prayers, hoping to ward off the evil spirits they thought caused the plague. Some communities believed that burning incense or wearing charming amulets around their necks would protect them. Others turned to more physical measures, such as applying aromatic substances or using the odd treatment of bloodletting, yes again. The truly bizarre treatments range from rubbing vinegar on the body to drinking strange potions made of animal parts. And don't even get me started on the infamous plague doctor masks. These strange, beaked masks, which have become synonymous with the Black Death, were filled with herbs and spices to protect the wearer from the miasma or bad air. They didn't know it, but the mask wasn't going to stop the plague. In fact, it likely did more to make the doctor look like something out of a horror movie than actually protect them from the disease. But in the absence of real medical knowledge, people turned to whatever rituals and beliefs they could. The really grim part of all this is that, in most cases, the treatments didn't work. People died. And when someone died, they often had no proper burial, just thrown into mass graves, with little regard for what once was a person. It was an era where death became so normalised that you could almost walk past it without blinking. People died so quickly that there was no time for anything more than the most basic rites. The sight of death became so commonplace that it no longer shocked the survivors. It became a part of everyday life, this ever-present companion that hung over the population like a dark cloud. One of the most tragic and striking aspects of the plague was that, in some regions, the people who died weren't just the poor or the sick. It wasn't just a disaster for the lower classes, but for everyone. Nobles and kings were just as vulnerable. In fact, many members of the royal families died, and some kingdoms were left in chaos, leaderless and struggling to survive. Entire dynasties crumbled as the Black Death moved through them. As the disease began to burn through Europe, entire social structures began to collapse. Families broke down, the economy halted, and society as a whole seemed to implode. You could almost hear the collective gasp of Europe as it grappled with the true scale of the tragedy. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed a way of life. Historians still argue about how the plague fundamentally reshaped the medieval world. Did it create an opportunity for social mobility? Did it give more power to the common people as the labour force dwindled and surviving workers demanded better wages? Did it pave the way for the Renaissance and the more humanistic outlook that followed? These debates are ongoing, and though the answers may vary, one thing is clear. The Black Death didn't just leave a trail of death, it left a legacy of transformation, though the cost was unimaginable. As we continue our journey through the devastation of the Black Death, let's explore one of the most unsettling aspects of this tragedy: the doctors, their cures, and the many bizarre treatments that were employed in a desperate attempt to stave off death. Now, it's easy to imagine doctors wearing starched robes and acting like medical professionals today, but back in the 14th century, things were far from that polished. In fact, many of the medical practices during the plague were nothing short of medieval in their lack of understanding. Let's take a look at the doctors of the time. When the plague first began to ravage Europe, medical professionals were as helpless as everyone else. Medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. There were no microscopes, no understanding of bacteria, and definitely no vaccines. In fact, there was no real understanding of how diseases spread. People didn't even know about germs. The idea of microorganisms was still centuries away, and so the methods employed to deal with the plague were a mix of superstition, rudimentary biology, and ancient practices. One of the first responses to the Black Death was quarantine. Certain towns and cities, hoping to stop the spread of the disease, closed their gates, hoping that if they kept everyone inside, the plague would be kept at bay. Of course, this didn't work. The disease was already inside, and closing the gates just trapped the infected in with the healthy. But at the time, this was the best idea they had. And it's a stark reminder that even the best minds of the time were essentially flying blind. Enter the doctors. When you think of a medieval doctor during the Black Death, you might picture someone wearing a long, flowing black robe with a bird-like mask. Those famous plague doctor masks are among the most iconic images of the period. But what exactly were these doctors trying to do with those beaks? It's not as macabre as it seems. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs and spices like rose petals, myrrh, and camphor. The doctors believed that these fragrances would purify the air, fighting off the bad miasma, which they believed caused the disease. Now, we know that this wasn't going to stop the plague. Those herbs didn't have the power to fight off bacteria, but for medieval doctors, it made sense. They didn't understand germs, so they focused on what they could see: the air, the smells, and the environment around them. While the doctors wore their protective beaked masks, they also carried long sticks to keep their distance from the infected. They would use the sticks to prod the sick, trying to assess their condition without getting too close. Of course, these tactics didn't work, but it's fascinating to think about the strange combination of knowledge, superstition, and pure desperation that shaped these early attempts at treating the plague. Imagine being a doctor, struggling to save lives with no idea what you were really up against. The grim humour of the situation is that, in many cases, these treatments were more likely to hasten the spread of the disease than to prevent it. But doctors weren't the only ones who were trying to treat the plague. Everyone, from local healers to religious figures, had their own ideas about how to fight the disease. There were plenty of treatments that seem absurd today, like bleeding patients in an attempt to balance their humours, or using leeches to suck out the bad blood. The strangest of them all, however, might have been the application of exotic substances like crocodile dung. Yes, you read that right. In an attempt to soothe the buboes, some medieval practitioners turned to a paste made of crocodile dung. The idea was that the dung would absorb the poison from the infected body. Spoiler alert, it didn't work, and people continued to die at alarming rates. But desperate times call for desperate measures, right? Some doctors recommended other bizarre treatments, including burning incense, drinking potions made from crushed gems, or even praying over the infected. Religious explanations for the plague were also rampant. Many believed it was God's punishment for humanity's sins. In fact, some groups took matters into their own hands and formed processions of flagellants who would publicly whip themselves as penance in the hopes that God would spare them. These groups travelled from town to town seeking redemption by inflicting physical pain on themselves. In a strange twist, the most widespread medical practice at the time wasn't based on science at all. It was superstition. Many people believed that the disease was brought on by evil spirits or witches. Some communities even took to executing suspected witches, thinking they were responsible for spreading the plague. Of course, this didn't help stop the disease, but it did add to the chaos and panic already gripping Europe. As the plague continued to spread, the desperate search for a cure only intensified. People tried to use every method they could think of to stave off death. Some believed that living a more pious life would protect them. Others relied on charms or lucky symbols, but none of these remedies worked. The plague, relentless in its fury, continued to spread, undeterred by the efforts of doctors, priests, or charlatans alike. The reality, though, is that by the time the doctors realised what was actually happening, it was already too late. There was no time for proper medical research or for developing treatments that could have stemmed the tide, and so the Black Death continued its rampage across Europe, claiming the lives of millions, leaving behind a trail of devastation that would take centuries to recover from. The aftermath of the Black Death wasn't just a matter of rebuilding, it was a matter of rethinking everything people knew about life and death. Medical knowledge would slowly advance, and new treatments would eventually be discovered, but the scars left by the plague remained. It reshaped the way people thought about disease, life, and their place in the world. Historians still debate the long-term effects of the plague on Europe. Did it lead to better medical practices? Did it prompt changes in how society dealt with death and disease? Some argue that the Black Death was the catalyst for the eventual rise of modern medicine, as the failures of medieval treatments led to a greater focus on scientific inquiry in the centuries that followed. Others suggest that it caused a social upheaval that weakened the old feudal order, giving rise to a new, more dynamic economy based on trade and industry. What's clear, however, is that the Black Death forced Europe to rethink everything it knew about life and death. As we continue our journey through this bleak but fascinating chapter of history, keep in mind that the stories of survival and resistance will soon emerge. For now, though, we remain at the crossroads of death and transformation, trying to understand how this unimaginable crisis could reshape the course of European history forever. Now that we've explored the treatments, beliefs, and medical practices during the plague, it's time to delve into the social and economic consequences of the Black Death. By this point, we've seen how the plague cut through Europe like a whirlwind, leaving death in its wake. But what happens when a vast percentage of the population is wiped out? What happens to the people who survive? How does society change in the wake of such devastation? Let's start by looking at the immediate impact: death. By the time the Black Death had passed through Europe, it had claimed between 30 to 60% of the population. In some areas, entire villages were wiped off the map. With so many people dead, the social structure of Europe was left in tatters. The labour force, which had once been relatively stable, was now decimated. This created a unique opportunity for those who survived. They became incredibly valuable. Think about it. Before the plague, peasants worked the land under a feudal system where they were tied to the land and often subjected to unfair treatment by the landowners. But now, with fewer workers available, the balance of power shifted. The demand for labour skyrocketed. Landowners, desperate for people to work the fields and tend to their estates, began offering better wages and improved living conditions. Suddenly, the serfs and peasants had bargaining power they had never had before. This shift in power led to the gradual decline of feudalism and the rise of a more wage-based economy. Historians still argue whether this shift marked the beginning of the end for feudalism, or if it was merely a temporary blip before things returned to normal. What's clear, though, is that the Black Death accelerated a profound transformation in Europe's social structure. It allowed for greater mobility and, in some cases, even the opportunity to acquire land and wealth. The survivors of the plague weren't just rebuilding, they were reshaping the future. Now let's look at the economic consequences. With so many people dead, the economic system that relied on agricultural production, trade and manual labour crumbled. The population loss led to a shortage of goods and services, and many businesses were left without workers. The resulting scarcity of products led to a rise in prices for the items that were still available. But while this inflation might have hurt some people, it benefited others, those who survived and could now demand higher wages for their work. Towns and cities that had once relied on trade were now crippled. With fewer people to buy and sell goods, markets shrank, and the bustling urban centres became ghost towns. But the survivors who remained in the cities found new opportunities. With fewer people competing for jobs, they could command higher wages. It's almost as if the survivors were given a second chance at life in a new economic system that didn't depend as heavily on traditional structures. The impact on the rural areas was even more severe. In many parts of Europe, entire villages were abandoned as families perished from the plague. The land that had once been carefully tended to by peasants was left to lie fallow. With a reduced workforce, the agricultural economy was left in disarray, and many regions experienced food shortages. But eventually the labourers who survived began to take control of the land and rebuild their lives. However, it took years for Europe to fully recover from the devastation the plague had caused to the agricultural economy. But there was also a cultural shift in the wake of the plague. The arts, literature and religion were all transformed in the wake of such widespread death. As people faced their own mortality on an unprecedented scale, they began to question the world around them. The fear of death, the horror of losing loved ones, and the feeling of helplessness in the face of an unseen enemy led to a re-evaluation of the human condition. One of the most noticeable changes was in art. The Black Death inspired what we now call danse macabre, or the dance of death motif, where death was depicted as an inevitable companion that could come for anyone at any time. Artists created images of skeletons or grim reapers leading people, regardless of age, status or occupation, into death's embrace. These images were stark reminders that death was no respecter of class, wealth or power. In fact, death was now everywhere, lingering over every corner of medieval life, from the poorest peasant to the richest noble. The plague forced everyone to confront their mortality in a way that had never been done before. Religious life, too, was deeply affected. As the plague swept through, many people turned to religion for comfort, believing that their suffering was a punishment from God. In some places, flagellants, groups of people who whipped themselves in public to atone for their sins, became a common sight. They believed that by punishing themselves, they could purify the world and end the plague. Some saw the disease as divine retribution for humanity's sins, a view that was especially common in the early stages of the plague. Others turned to more traditional religious practices, praying for divine intervention or seeking absolution through confession. Interestingly, however, not everyone turned to religion for solace. As the death toll rose and people saw the failure of religious practices to protect them from the plague, some began to question their faith. The traditional power of the church was slowly eroded by the plague. Many people began to wonder why God would allow such suffering and death to take so many, including the clergy, who were often the first to be struck down. In fact, many priests died alongside their parishioners, and their absence left a spiritual void in many communities. The Black Death also had a profound effect on people's attitudes toward life and death. People became more fatalistic, accepting death as an unavoidable part of life. This shift in perspective led to a greater emphasis on living for the moment, and some even turned to hedonistic behaviours as a response to the realization that life could be short and unpredictable. Historians still argue whether the Black Death caused a complete breakdown of religious authority in medieval Europe. Did it lead to the eventual decline of the Church's power, or did it simply shift people's focus away from the clergy and towards more personal expressions of faith? Regardless, one thing is clear: the plague radically altered the religious landscape of Europe. Socially and culturally, the Black Death changed the fabric of European society in ways that were both subtle and profound. From the rise of a more flexible and mobile workforce to the profound impact on religious and artistic life, the Black Death set the stage for the transformations that would unfold over the next several centuries. It was a time of rebuilding, but it was also a time of rethinking everything that had come before. The world that emerged from the ashes of the Black Death wasn't the same as the one that had existed before. The plague had shattered many of the old social and economic structures, leaving space for something new to take root. That something new would lead to the Renaissance, the rise of capitalism, and the slow but steady decline of feudalism. But for now, let's pause and reflect on how these transformations happened. The survivors of the Black Death were not just rebuilding, they were laying the foundations for the modern world. Now that we've explored the profound social and economic upheaval caused by the Black Death, it's time to consider the long-term effects this catastrophe had on Europe. The immediate impact was devastation. Whole communities lost their inhabitants, cities crumbled, and the death toll was staggering. But beyond the immediate grief and chaos, the Black Death also forced Europe to rethink its structures, philosophies, and understanding of life itself. While the plague didn't create the modern world, it laid the groundwork for significant change in the centuries that followed. One of the most immediate consequences of the Black Death was the significant shift in the balance of power. Before the plague, Europe was governed largely by a feudal system, where power was concentrated in the hands of a few aristocrats, and the majority of the population, peasants and serfs, had little control over their lives. The plague, by decimating the population, created a labour shortage, and those who survived now had greater bargaining power. Serfs and peasants, once bound to the land and subject to harsh treatment by the landowners, suddenly found themselves in a position to demand higher wages and better living conditions. For the first time, the lower classes had some leverage over the landowners. This shift was not an immediate overthrow of the old feudal order, but it marked the beginning of the end for feudalism. With fewer workers available, landlords had no choice but to raise wages and offer better terms to attract labourers. This created a more dynamic wage-based economy, which gradually eroded the rigid feudal system. Historians still debate whether this change was the direct result of the Black Death, or if it was simply the catalyst that accelerated a trend already underway. Nevertheless, the shift in power dynamics had lasting effects on the economy and social structure of Europe. Another significant consequence of the plague was the demographic shift that occurred. With millions of people dead, the overall population of Europe shrank dramatically. The loss of so many people had a profound effect on the labour force, and it took many years for the population to recover. But during this time, Europe's landscape changed in subtle but important ways. Land that had once been used for farming was abandoned or repurposed, and some areas saw a rise in forested regions as agriculture declined. Towns and villages once teeming with life became ghost towns. As a result, the economies of many regions had to be rebuilt from the ground up. As the population began to recover, there was a noticeable shift in attitudes toward labour. With fewer people to work the land, there was more demand for skilled labourers and craftsmen. In the long run, this helped contribute to the rise of a more specialised workforce, and laid the foundation for the rise of urban centres and cities, where industries like trade and manufacturing began to flourish. The slow migration from rural areas to urban centres, a trend that had already started before the plague, was now accelerated. Over the course of several centuries, this shift contributed to the growth of the middle class and the eventual emergence of modern capitalism. The plague's impact on the church was also profound. As we discussed earlier, many people turned to religion for solace, hoping that divine intervention would protect them from the disease. However, when the plague showed no mercy, striking down even the clergy, faith in the church's ability to offer protection began to wane. The church was hit hard by the loss of priests and monks, and entire monasteries were wiped out. This left a spiritual void in many regions, and for the first time many began to question the authority of the church. In fact, the Black Death marked the beginning of a gradual decline in the church's unchallenged power over Europe. While some historians argue that the church's influence remained strong in the wake of the plague, others suggest that it was during this time that people began to seek out new, more personal forms of spirituality. The questioning of the church's power was one of the seeds of the later Protestant Reformation, which would erupt nearly 2 centuries later. The Black Death, in its grim and unintended way, helped fuel the fires of religious reform by sowing the seeds of doubt in the hearts of millions. Beyond the religious and economic transformations, the Black Death also had a profound effect on culture. As death became an ever-present part of daily life, artists, poets, and thinkers began to examine the nature of life, death, and human existence in ways they never had before. The most striking manifestation of this new focus on death was the danse macabre, or dance of death, that became prevalent in art during the aftermath of the plague. In these works, death was depicted as a skeletal figure, often leading people from all walks of life, peasants, nobles, clergy, into the grave. The dance of death is a vivid reminder of how pervasive the fear of death was at the time. It wasn't just an abstract concept, It was something that could be seen, felt, and experienced daily. Artists used this motif to express the idea that death came for everyone, regardless of their status, wealth, or position in life. The Black Death also led to a flourishing of new ideas. In the wake of the disaster, many intellectuals and scholars began to rethink old ideas about health, disease, and the human body. The plague's impact on medical knowledge was profound. Although people still lacked a clear understanding of germs or bacteria, the need for better medical practices became undeniable. This led to the gradual development of modern medical practices, and by the time of the Renaissance, European physicians were beginning to embrace more scientific methods of treatment. While the plague itself did not lead directly to the advancement of medicine, it undeniably played a role in prompting the shift toward a more empirical scientific approach to health. We also can't ignore the ways in which the Black Death reshaped Europe's political landscape. As entire dynasties and kingdoms lost members to the plague, power vacuums emerged. In some cases, this led to a rise in the power of local leaders, as centralised authority weakened. At the same time, the decline of feudalism allowed for the growth of more powerful centralised states. The plague's role in the breakdown of feudalism and the rise of centralised monarchies can be seen as an indirect precursor to the modern nation-state. As you can imagine, the aftermath of the Black Death wasn't just a period of rebuilding. It was a time of profound transformation. The plague may have seemed like an apocalyptic event, one that could never be recovered from, but in the long run it set Europe on a new course. From the rise of the middle class to the beginnings of modern medical practices, the Black Death left behind a legacy that would continue to shape European history for centuries. It's a strange, almost paradoxical outcome. A tragedy of unimaginable proportions led to the rethinking of everything: social structures, economic systems, religious authority, and even the very way people viewed life and death. The survivors of the plague lived through a moment of unparalleled devastation, but they also lived to witness a time of unprecedented change, a time that would give birth to a new world order. The question still remains, though. Was the Black Death the turning point that led to the modern world, or was it just one of many events in a slow and steady process of change? Historians continue to debate this question, but one thing is certain. The plague didn't just kill millions of people, it changed the course of history in ways no one could have predicted. As we continue to sift through the aftermath of the Black Death, we move from the social, economic and cultural shifts it sparked to another key point in history: how the plague's reach stretched beyond Europe, affecting regions across Asia, Africa and the Middle East. While Europe certainly bore the brunt of the devastation, the Black Death was not a localised event. It had a global footprint, marking a dark chapter not just for one continent, but for the entire old world. To start, let's rewind a little. Before it ravaged Europe, the Black Death had already been spreading across Asia. It's believed to have originated in China, where early reports tell of a deadly disease striking down whole communities in the 1330s. However, it wasn't until 1346 that it made its way westward. The plague spread along trade routes, specifically the Silk Road, which was a well-established network of caravan trails and merchant paths connecting the East with Europe. The Mongols, who controlled much of Asia at the time, were instrumental in maintaining these routes, and their armies, along with merchants, helped spread the disease further. The exact path of the plague from Asia to Europe is still debated by historians. Some suggest it spread westward via the armies of the Mongol Empire, while others point to the movement of trade ships as the primary means of transmission. What is clear, however, is that the Black Death travelled from Central Asia to the Black Sea and beyond, reaching port cities like Constantinople, which was one of the first major urban centres to be hit by the plague. In 1347, as we know, the disease made its way to Sicily and other parts of Italy. From there, it spread to the rest of Europe with stunning speed. But just as the plague struck Europe, it also continued its path eastward. By 1347, the disease had already reached Egypt and the Middle East, where it wreaked havoc on the densely populated cities and trade centres. Egypt, a vital centre of Islamic culture, felt the effects of the Black Death severely. Cairo, a major hub of the Islamic world, was decimated. It's estimated that the plague killed between 25 to 30% of Egypt's population, leaving behind a shattered economy and a society struggling to survive. In the Middle East, the effects of the plague were felt deeply in cities like Baghdad and Damascus. These urban centres were important for both their intellectual contributions and their bustling markets. When the plague struck, it devastated the intellectual elite as well as the merchants who kept the economy running. This weakened the region's cultural and economic power for decades. The religious consequences were equally far-reaching. As in Europe, many turned to religious explanations for the disease, believing it was a divine punishment. In the aftermath, various forms of religious reform began to take root, echoing the shift that occurred in Europe. As the old religious orders were questioned and new movements emerged in the wake of the devastation. By 1349, the plague had spread to the Indian subcontinent, although it took a slightly different path there. The movement of troops, merchants and pilgrims across the region helped carry the disease, though it is believed that the massive population density in places like Delhi and Calcutta helped the disease spread quickly. However, the Black Death did not hit India with the same intensity it had in Europe. Scholars are still debating why, with some suggesting that the hot and humid climate might have hindered the spread, while others believe it simply took longer to make its full impact. Regardless, India experienced significant losses, with millions of deaths, and the subsequent economic and social repercussions were widespread. Let's not forget Africa. While sub-Saharan Africa didn't experience the same scale of devastation as Asia or Europe, the North African coast was greatly affected. The plague reached as far as Morocco, Tunisia and Algeria, and the urban centres of these regions saw significant loss of life. The disease also spread through the trans-Saharan trade routes, which had been crucial for connecting Africa with Europe and the Middle East. As a result, the Black Death disrupted long-established trade and caused a breakdown in social order. Throughout Africa and Asia, the impacts of the plague were multifaceted. In some regions, the disease decimated entire communities, leaving villages abandoned and the landscape eerily silent. In others, it sparked deep social and political unrest as people searched for answers to the disease's terrifying effects. Despite the variations in the way it affected different regions, the Black Death was a global catastrophe, influencing civilizations on an unprecedented scale. Historians still argue over the long-term consequences of the plague in these regions. Did it lead to a cultural stagnation in some places? Was there a rise in intellectual or technological advancements elsewhere due to the disruption caused by the plague? Some argue that the plague, by removing large portions of the population, led to a kind of social reset that allowed for greater political centralization and the eventual rise of empires in certain regions. Others point out that the Black Death created a sense of fear and helplessness that lingered long after the disease passed. Interestingly, the plague's impact on global trade cannot be understated. The disease not only decimated the population, but also crippled the global trade networks that had been built over centuries. The Silk Road, which had once connected the East and West, was disrupted as cities along the route fell to the plague. Port cities along the Mediterranean, crucial for trade between Africa, Asia and Europe, also saw their economies grind to a halt as the plague wiped out workers and merchants. This collapse of international trade had long-lasting effects, with many regions taking years to recover economically. The Black Death also had a profound influence on the way people viewed trade and commerce. In the aftermath, many people began to look more inward, focusing on local economies rather than relying on distant trade routes. This shift in focus helped foster the growth of early capitalism in some parts of Europe, particularly in the cities that had survived the worst of the plague. It was a time of rebuilding and reinvention, one that set the stage for the Renaissance and the eventual rise of European dominance in world trade. Looking back, it's clear that the Black Death was a catalyst for major global change. From the collapsing empires of Asia and the Middle East to the shifting political landscape of Europe, the effects of the plague were felt around the world, and while the disease brought tremendous suffering and devastation, it also set the stage for the creation of new political and economic systems, transforming the course of history forever. The The Black Death may have been a tragedy of unimaginable proportions, but it was also the event that marked the beginning of the modern age. As we continue to explore the aftermath of the Black Death, it's time to shift our focus to one of the most intriguing aspects of this tragedy: the survivors. While the plague took millions of lives, leaving devastation in its wake, the survivors were tasked with rebuilding, and in some ways redefining, a world that had been irrevocably changed. Who were these survivors, and how did they cope with the loss of so much? What lessons did they take away from their brush with death, and how did they help steer Europe through the uncertain and often terrifying aftermath of the plague? First, it's important to understand the context in which the survivors found themselves. The Black Death left an indelible mark on society, one that altered the way people viewed themselves and their world. With nearly half of the population wiped out in some places, many survivors were left to mourn not just the loss of loved ones, but also the loss of a way of life. Entire communities had been decimated, cities abandoned, and farmland left untended. It's hard to imagine the kind of trauma survivors endured, knowing that their world was forever altered. The grief was overwhelming, but the survivors had no choice but to press on. One of the most significant changes for survivors was the shift in social and economic dynamics. With so many people gone, those who remained suddenly found themselves in positions of power and influence they had never imagined. A massive labour shortage meant that surviving workers, from agricultural labourers to craftsmen, could demand higher wages and better living conditions. This shift in the labour market marked the decline of feudalism, which had been the backbone of medieval society for centuries. The feudal system, which had tightly bound peasants to the land and their lords, was now starting to crumble. Survivors could move more freely, finding new opportunities in urban centres and forging new lives in places that had once been closed off to them. But while this newfound mobility provided new opportunities for many, it also led to tension and unrest. The gap between the wealthy and the poor began to grow, with the rich struggling to maintain their power in the face of a changing society. The survivors were no longer content to remain passive in a system that had so deeply failed them. In England, for example, laws were passed to limit the wages of labourers, attempting to return to the old order. These attempts to reinstate the old social hierarchies led to resistance, notably the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, which highlighted the growing discontent among the working class. This revolt, fueled by frustration and resentment over the conditions following the plague, was one of the first signs of a larger, more profound shift in power that would continue throughout the centuries. Meanwhile, survivors in urban areas had to contend with the collapse of much of the infrastructure that had supported their daily lives. With markets and trade disrupted by the plague, many cities faced economic stagnation. But as time went on, these urban survivors began to rebuild, and new industries took root in places that had once been ravaged by the disease. The emergence of new trade networks and the rise of capitalism were among the key elements that helped survivors lay the foundation for a more modern economic system. Cities like Florence, Milan, and Venice began to thrive once again. The survivors capitalized on opportunities to trade goods and services in ways that were unimaginable before the plague. Culturally, the survivors were deeply influenced by the trauma they had lived through. The Black Death didn't just destroy the physical fabric of society, it also shattered people's worldview. Many survivors, especially those who had witnessed the devastation firsthand, began to question the role of religion and faith in their lives. The Church, which had been a guiding force for medieval Europe, had failed to protect them from the plague, leading many to wonder about the power and authority of the clergy. For some, the plague was a punishment from God for their sins, but for others, it was a sign that the traditional religious institutions were not as powerful as they had once believed. This disillusionment with the Church paved the way for the rise of new religious movements, many of which would later challenge the Catholic Church's dominance. The decline in church authority and the questioning of traditional religious practices also set the stage for the Protestant Reformation, which would erupt in the early 16th century. Survivors, with their new sense of agency and skepticism, began to demand a more personal relationship with God, one that didn't rely on the clergy. This shift in religious thinking would reverberate throughout Europe for generations. The survivors also played a key role in preserving and reinterpreting the cultural knowledge of the past. In the wake of the Black Death, there was a renewed interest in classical learning, and many survivors sought to reconnect with the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans. This intellectual revival would eventually lead to the Renaissance, a period of remarkable cultural, artistic and scientific achievement. The Renaissance was, in many ways, a rebirth of Europe's intellectual life, and it was driven in part by the survivors' desire to rebuild a world that had been lost to the ravages of the plague. But not all survivors were focused on rebuilding. Some, understandably, turned inward, reflecting on the deeper philosophical questions that the Black Death had raised. The plague had exposed the fragility of life, and many survivors came to believe that life should be lived more fully, even in the face of uncertainty. This new outlook on life found expression in art, literature and philosophy. The Dance of Death motif, which depicted death as a universal force that could take anyone at any time, became a central theme in post-plague art. It was a stark reminder that death was inescapable, and it urged survivors to appreciate the fleeting nature of life. In the realm of art, the survivors expressed their newly gained understanding of mortality in works that emphasized the transience of life. Artists began to paint with more realism, showing the physicality of death in ways that were rarely depicted before. These works often featured rotting corpses, skeletal figures, and decaying landscapes, all designed to remind the viewer of the inevitability of death. This shift in artistic focus reflected the survivors' changing relationship with the world and their understanding of the human condition. Philosophically, the Black Death also prompted a re-evaluation of human existence. For many survivors, the plague was a reminder that life was fragile and unpredictable. This new outlook gave rise to ideas about the impermanence of worldly things and the importance of spiritual salvation. The aftermath of the plague also spurred greater interest in philosophy and the nature of the human soul, helping to lay the intellectual groundwork for the Renaissance. The survivors of the Black Death were more than just the last people standing. They were the architects of a new world, one that was forever altered by the experience of mass death and societal collapse. From reshaping the labour market and questioning religious authority, to fostering the intellectual currents that would lead to the Renaissance, the survivors played a key role in transforming Europe into the modern world we recognise today. Their experiences, though born of immense suffering, became the foundation for future growth and change, and their resilience helped push Europe into a new age. As we continue to reflect on this time, it's important to remember that the Black Death didn't just kill millions, it sparked the seeds of change that would lead to a renaissance of human thought, culture, and society. The survivors, with their newfound wisdom and their strength, rebuilt not just their cities and villages, but the very fabric of European civilization. As we reflect on the survivors and the transformations that followed the Black Death, it's time to explore the broader long-term consequences of this devastating event. While the plague did indeed have immediate and dramatic effects, it also triggered a series of changes that would reshape European society, culture and politics for centuries to come. These changes were not always visible immediately, but over time, the ripple effects of the Black Death would lay the groundwork for major shifts in the way people lived, thought and interacted with one another. One of the most significant changes was the transition from a feudal economy to one that was more capitalist in nature. Feudalism, which had dominated medieval Europe for centuries, was based on a rigid class structure where peasants worked the land in exchange for protection from their lords. However, the Black Death's massive depopulation disrupted this system. With so many peasants and workers dying, the surviving labour force became much more valuable. Workers could now demand higher wages, better working conditions, and more freedom to move between towns and cities in search of better opportunities. This newfound labour power didn't just benefit the peasants though. The landowners, while initially struggling to adjust to the labour shortage, were forced to offer better conditions to attract workers. In some cases, this led to improvements in wages and living conditions for labourers, and even the beginnings of a market economy, where landowners had to respond to supply and demand just as merchants had been doing for centuries. The Black Death, in a sense, broke down the old feudal structure and opened the door for the rise of a more flexible and dynamic economic system, one that would later evolve into the capitalism we recognise today. Historians still debate whether this was a slow shift that would have happened anyway, or if the Black Death accelerated this transformation. However, it's clear that the plague played a key role in breaking the grip of feudalism and sparking the growth of new economic ideas, eventually contributing to the rise of banking, trade and industry that would define the Renaissance and the early modern period. Another major consequence of the Black Death was the rise of centralised monarchies. Before the plague, Europe was a patchwork of competing feudal kingdoms, each ruled by local lords who had a great deal of power over their regions. The plague, however, created a power vacuum. As so many landowners died, their estates were left without heirs or leadership, and local control weakened. In some cases, this led to stronger monarchies consolidating power. Kings and queens began to take advantage of the chaos caused by the plague to centralise authority, weakening the feudal system in the process. This shift laid the groundwork for the rise of the powerful nation-states that would dominate Europe in the centuries to come. But it wasn't just politics that was altered by the Black Death. The religious and cultural landscape of Europe was also profoundly changed. As we discussed earlier, the Catholic Church's authority was severely shaken by the plague. The failure of the Church to protect people from the disease caused many to question the very foundations of religious authority. In fact, this questioning would play a major role in the development of the Renaissance and the eventual Protestant Reformation. The Renaissance, which began in Italy in the 14th century, was in many ways a response to the intellectual and spiritual crisis caused by the plague. Survivors, disillusioned with the religious explanations for the plague and the Church's inability to prevent it, sought new ways of thinking about the world. Humanism, the intellectual movement that emphasized the value of individual experience and the study of classical Greek and Roman texts, became the dominant ideology of the time. People began to look back to ancient Greece and Rome, rediscovering a wealth of knowledge about art, science, and philosophy that had been lost during the Middle Ages. This intellectual revival led to a period of artistic and scientific achievement, which is now known as the Renaissance. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael began to explore new techniques and ideas, leading to some of the greatest works of art in history. Similarly, scientists like Copernicus and Galileo challenged long-held beliefs about the universe, laying the groundwork for the scientific revolution that would follow in the coming centuries. But the Renaissance wasn't just about art and science, it was also a time of political change. The centralisation of power in the hands of monarchs created more stable and unified nations, which, in turn, helped to fuel the growth of trade and exploration. The rise of powerful monarchs like Henry VIII of England and Louis XIV of France set the stage for the creation of the modern nation-state and the global empires that would follow in the age of exploration. Beyond the political and cultural shifts, the Black Death also had profound effects on European society's understanding of disease, health, and medicine. While the plague itself did not immediately lead to medical advancements, it forced Europe to confront the limitations of medieval medicine and to begin questioning its approach to health. As the plague receded, doctors and scholars began to reconsider their views on disease, setting the stage for the later development of more scientific approaches to health. In the long run, the Black Death led to improvements in medical understanding, as physicians began to focus on the study of anatomy, hygiene, and the natural world in ways that were not possible in the medieval period. The lessons learned from the Black Death also influenced the development of public health systems. In the wake of the plague, some cities and regions began to implement rudimentary quarantine measures and sanitary reforms to prevent future outbreaks. These early efforts laid the groundwork for the more sophisticated public health systems that would develop over the centuries. In some places, like Venice, health authorities created quarantine stations, where ships suspected of carrying the plague were forced to wait before they could dock. These early efforts were by no means perfect, but they marked the beginning of a more organised approach to public health that would evolve in the centuries to come. On a more personal level, the Black Death also had a lasting impact on people's relationships with death and the afterlife. In the immediate aftermath of the plague, death became a constant companion, and survivors were forced to confront their own mortality in a way that had never been necessary before. People began to focus more on the here and now, living for the moment and seeking enjoyment in the face of uncertainty. This shift in perspective, which was particularly evident in art and literature, had a profound effect on European culture, leading to a more individualistic, human-centred worldview. While the immediate aftermath of the Black Death was filled with chaos, fear and grief, it ultimately laid the groundwork for a new world, a world that would come to be defined by the Renaissance, the rise of capitalism, the development of the modern nation-state, and the gradual advancement of science and medicine. It is remarkable to think that such a terrible tragedy, which cost millions of lives, would also pave the way for so many of the changes that would define the modern world. The Black Death was not just a turning point in history, it was a catalyst for the transformation of Europe. The survivors, in their efforts to rebuild their lives, unwittingly set in motion a series of events that would shape the future of the continent and the world. As we look back on this dark chapter of history, it's important to remember not just the devastation and loss, but also the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable hardship. As we move forward in our exploration of the aftermath of the Black Death, let's focus on one of the most fascinating and paradoxical consequences of this tragedy: the surge in artistic and intellectual output that occurred in the wake of such devastation. In a period defined by plague, death and suffering, the survivors didn't retreat into despair. Instead, they began to look forward, using their experiences with mortality and loss to fuel some of the most significant cultural, artistic, and intellectual movements in European history. The Black Death may have shattered Europe, but it also gave rise to the Renaissance, an era that would redefine Europe's creative and intellectual landscape. The Black Death profoundly altered people's outlook on life, death, and the human experience. Before the plague, life in medieval Europe was largely governed by religious dogma and an unquestioning acceptance of the natural order. The Church was the central authority, and for the majority of people, religion was the lens through which they understood everything. The Black Death, however, forced people to confront the randomness and brutality of life. Death came for everyone, rich or poor, young or old, with no distinction. The sheer scale of the plague, and the complete inability of the Church and religious practices to offer protection, shattered people's faith in the old systems. With this disillusionment came a new perspective, a human-centred perspective, that began to shape the intellectual currents of the time. As the survivors grappled with the trauma of the plague, they turned to new ways of thinking. Intellectuals and artists began to question old ideas, embracing humanism, a philosophy that emphasized the value of individual experience, creativity, and reason. Humanism encouraged people to focus not just on the afterlife, but on the here and now, on the potential of the human being to shape their own destiny. This shift in thinking laid the groundwork for the Renaissance, a period of immense artistic, cultural and intellectual achievement that began in Italy in the 14th century and spread across Europe. Artists and thinkers began to rediscover the classical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome, drawing inspiration from the works of philosophers like Aristotle and Plato. This revival of classical knowledge sparked a transformation in European thought, one that celebrated human potential and creativity. The Renaissance was a time of artistic innovation. The Black Death had wiped out many of the traditional patrons of the arts, the nobles, the church leaders, and the wealthy merchants. Yet, paradoxically, the collapse of the old order gave rise to a new class of art patrons. Wealthier merchants and newly empowered rulers began to support the arts, commissioning works from artists who would become legends. This new influx of funding helped fuel the Renaissance's most famous achievements in painting, sculpture, and architecture. Perhaps the most iconic artists of the period, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael, were directly influenced by the worldview that emerged from the Black Death. They were driven by a desire to capture the complexities of the human experience, reflecting the Renaissance's new focus on individualism, self-expression, and the exploration of the human condition. artists began to focus on realistic depictions of the human body, mastering techniques such as perspective and chiaroscuro to create works that seemed to come to life. The art of the Renaissance was not just about religious subjects, it was about the human experience in all its complexity. These artists were no longer content with the simple religious imagery that had dominated medieval art. They sought to explore the depths of human emotion, personal achievement, and the natural world. The most famous works of the Renaissance reflect this transformation. Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, for example, with its enigmatic smile and lifelike detail, was a departure from the flat, stylized images of the medieval period. Michelangelo's David is another stunning example of Renaissance artistry, capturing the human form in all its beauty and strength. These masterpieces were not just artistic achievements, they were expressions of the new humanistic philosophy that emerged in the wake of the Black Death. But the Renaissance wasn't just about art, it was also a time of intellectual renewal. Scholars, inspired by the rediscovery of ancient texts, began to challenge long-held ideas about science, philosophy and religion. The humanist movement led to a flourishing of literature, with writers like Petrarch and Boccaccio embracing the idea that the study of ancient texts could lead to a deeper understanding of the human experience. This intellectual movement would eventually lay the foundation for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment that would follow centuries later. One of the most profound shifts in thinking that emerged from the Renaissance was the changing view of humanity itself. The plague had forced people to reckon with the fragility of life, and this led to a renewed focus on human potential. Rather than seeing humans as powerless before God's will, as had been the medieval view, Renaissance thinkers began to embrace the idea of human agency and the possibility of individual achievement. This new philosophy, known as humanism, placed the individual at the centre of intellectual and artistic life, celebrating human creativity, reason, and exploration. At the same time, the Renaissance's emphasis on secularism, an interest in human affairs apart from religious concerns, was a sharp break from the medieval mindset. While religion still played a central role in daily life, humanists sought to understand the world through reason, science, and observation, rather than relying solely on divine authority. This shift in thinking opened the door for advances in many fields, from astronomy to physics to medicine. The works of Renaissance scientists like Copernicus and Galileo challenged the geocentric model of the universe, while innovations in anatomy and surgery began to improve medical practice. The Renaissance also marked a new era in education. Scholars began to emphasize the study of the classics, Greek and Roman literature, philosophy and history, as the foundation of intellectual life. Universities and schools began to teach not just theology, but a wide range of subjects, including literature, science, and the arts. This educational transformation would have a lasting impact, laying the groundwork for the development of the modern educational system. While the Renaissance is often seen as a golden age, it's important to remember that it arose from the ashes of the Black Death. The survivors of the plague, faced with the loss of their loved ones and the collapse of their world, turned to creativity and intellectual exploration as a means of coping with their grief and uncertainty. The plague had devastated Europe, but in its wake, it gave birth to a new era of cultural and intellectual growth, one that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. The Black Death had one more indirect but powerful effect, the way it reshaped the relationship between humans and the natural world. Before the plague, people had often viewed nature as something to be controlled, tamed, and subdued. But after the devastation, there was a shift in perspective. The survivors began to look at the world with a sense of wonder, not just fear, seeking to understand its mysteries rather than simply trying to dominate it. This renewed interest in nature and human potential became one of the driving forces behind the scientific revolution, which would occur just a few centuries later. So, in a way, the Black Death did not just mark the end of an era, it marked the beginning of another. It pushed Europe into a period of profound reflection and transformation, leading to intellectual, cultural and artistic achievements that we still celebrate today. It is a testament to human resilience that from such devastation emerged some of the most enduring legacies of Western civilization. As we continue our journey through the reverberations of the Black Death, it's time to focus on the global aspects of the plague and how its effects rippled across the entire world, creating long-lasting changes in trade, diplomacy, and the movement of ideas. While the plague's impact on Europe and Asia is often the focus of historical narratives, it's important to consider how it affected the interconnected global world of the 14th century. In Europe, the Black Death was the first major disruption to the pre-existing global trade systems that had been flourishing since the late Middle Ages. With the rise of powerful empires like the Mongol Empire and the expansion of trade routes across Asia, Europe had become increasingly intertwined with the rest of the world. The Silk Road, a vast network of land routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, was already facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas and cultures between East and West. This network of trade and exchange was responsible for bringing many exotic goods into Europe, such as silk, spices and precious metals. But it also played a key role in spreading the plague from Asia to Europe. The very trade routes that had fostered global commerce now became conduits for a deadly disease that would devastate populations across the old world. The plague's reach across trade routes was swift and all-encompassing. It spread to Central Asia and the Middle East through the movement of merchants and caravans, which were an integral part of the Silk Road trade. By the time the plague reached the ports of the Black Sea, it had already spread across large parts of the Mongol Empire, which extended from China to Eastern Europe. In fact, it's believed that the Mongols, having established extensive trade networks and movements of people, helped the plague move rapidly from Asia into Europe. The Mediterranean Sea became the primary route for the plague's transmission to Europe. Italian merchant ships, particularly those from Genoa and Venice, were crucial in linking Europe with the rest of the world. These cities, with their extensive networks of ports and trade routes, were the first to be hit by the plague. The disease spread quickly through these Mediterranean ports, and soon it reached the rest of Europe, carried by ships and travellers, many of whom were unaware of the catastrophe that was unfolding. But the Black Death didn't just change Europe, it also reshaped the global flow of goods and ideas. The sudden and severe disruption to trade during the height of the plague caused economic devastation, which took years to recover from. This disruption led to a collapse in the supply of goods from the East, as well as a sharp decline in demand for luxury items. Trade and commerce slowed significantly, and many of the Mediterranean port cities that had once thrived on international trade, like Venice and Genoa, saw their economies grind to a halt. However, this economic setback did not mark the end of global commerce. Instead, it marked a turning point in the way trade was conducted, particularly in how it would evolve in the centuries following the Black Death. With many of the older trading systems having collapsed, new routes and methods of trade began to emerge. In the wake of the plague, the rise of new economic powers and the establishment of European maritime empires paved the way for the age of exploration, which would begin in the late 15th century. At the same time, the global nature of the Black Death is also a reminder of how interconnected the medieval world was, even though it may not have appeared that way from the perspective of people living at the time. The very networks that brought merchants and goods across vast distances were the same networks that carried disease across continents. The plague, through its sheer destructive power, showed how fragile these networks were. And although it brought death and destruction, it also forced a re-evaluation of the systems in place, both globally and locally. In the Middle East, the Black Death's effects were just as devastating. Cities like Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad were hit hard by the plague, as they were central hubs of trade and culture. The Middle East, which had once been at the crossroads of East and West, now found itself isolated and decimated by the plague. This isolation weakened the power and influence of the Islamic world, just as Europe was beginning to recover from the crisis. The cultural, intellectual and economic decline in the Middle East left a vacuum that would later be filled by the expansion of European empires. The loss of population in the Middle East also had long-lasting effects on agriculture and urban development. As people died in droves, vast swathes of farmland were left untended, and the cities themselves began to decline. The once great cities of the Islamic world, which had been centres of learning and culture, fell into disrepair. This decline led to a shift in the balance of power between the East and West. While Europe, particularly in the wake of the Renaissance, began to rise again, the Islamic world faced a period of stagnation, unable to recover the level of influence it had held prior to the plague. While Europe and the Middle East grappled with the consequences of the Black Death, Asia was also profoundly affected. The plague's arrival in China caused widespread devastation. The densely populated cities of China, like Hangzhou and Beijing, saw catastrophic loss of life. The Yuan dynasty, which ruled over China at the time, struggled to maintain control over its vast empire. The political instability caused by the plague led to the eventual collapse of the Yuan dynasty in 1368, paving the way for the rise of the Ming dynasty. The Black Death, despite its devastating toll, also had a lasting impact on the global movement of ideas. As the plague devastated Asia, it led to the end of the Pax Mongolica, the relative peace that had allowed for the free flow of goods, people, and ideas across Eurasia. However, it was also during this period that the transfer of knowledge began to slow, only to be rekindled during the Renaissance, when ideas and technologies began to flow more freely between Europe, the Middle East and Asia once again. In many ways, the Black Death set in motion a series of transformations that would reshape the world's political, economic and cultural structures. It disrupted established trade routes, led to the rise of new powers, and influenced the spread of scientific and philosophical knowledge. And most significantly, it showed the interconnectedness of the world, proving that the global networks that existed in the 14th century were both fragile and resilient, able to recover from catastrophe and evolve over time. Ultimately, the Black Death was a reminder of the fragility of human existence, but it was also an event that helped shape the course of history, influencing the political, social and economic dynamics of Europe, Asia and the Middle East for generations to come. As we journey deeper into the aftermath of the Black Death, we turn our attention to the long-lasting cultural and intellectual shifts that would continue to shape Europe in the centuries following the plague. The widespread trauma and devastation caused by the Black Death had far-reaching effects on not just the social and economic structures of Europe, but also on the arts, education, and scientific inquiry. These shifts, born out of the chaos of the plague, would eventually contribute to the birth of the Renaissance and the beginning of the modern age. First, let's take a closer look at how the Black Death affected education and intellectual life in Europe. Before the plague, education in medieval Europe was primarily controlled by the Catholic Church, and learning was largely confined to monasteries and cathedral schools. The Church was the central authority for all matters of knowledge, and scholars were expected to study religious texts, such as the Bible and writings by early Church Fathers. However, after the devastation of the plague, many intellectuals began to question the Church's authority and the rigid structure that had dominated European life for centuries. This period of questioning coincided with the rise of humanism, a cultural and intellectual movement that sought to recover the classical ideals of ancient Greece and Rome. Humanists believed that the study of ancient texts, especially works by philosophers, historians and poets, would help people develop a more balanced and rational understanding of the world. This intellectual shift placed emphasis on the human experience, individualism, and reason, rather than focusing solely on religious doctrine. The study of classical Greek and Latin texts became central to the humanist movement, and scholars began to recover long-lost works by authors such as Aristotle, Plato, and Cicero. These rediscoveries helped to open up new intellectual horizons and inspire a more secular and human-centered view of the world. Humanism also led to an increased focus on literature, art, and history, laying the intellectual foundations for the Renaissance. In the aftermath of the Black Death, there was a renewed interest in education, but this time it was broader in scope. Universities, particularly in Italy, became centres of learning that incorporated new subjects including the sciences, philosophy and the humanities. Scholars like Petrarch and Boccaccio, who had lived through the horrors of the plague, began to write about the human condition, exploring themes of death, life and individual agency. Their works helped to usher in a new intellectual era, one that sought to understand the complexities of the human experience outside the constraints of religious dogma. At the same time, the Black Death also led to significant changes in the arts. As we've discussed before, the plague's pervasive presence in daily life made death a constant and unavoidable part of the human experience. Artists began to reflect this in their work, creating more realistic and poignant depictions of death and suffering. The danse macabre became a recurring theme in post-plague art, representing death's inevitable march through all levels of society. These images of skeletons and rotting corpses were not just reminders of mortality, they were also expressions of the deep existential questions that emerged in the wake of the plague. The fear of death and the contemplation of the human condition were no longer confined to religious themes. Artists began to explore human life in all its complexity, including its vulnerability, beauty, and transient nature. The works of early Renaissance artists such as Giotto, who focused on human emotions and realistic depictions of the world, were reflective of this new approach. They embraced a more naturalistic style that sought to represent the real world, rather than adhering to the stylized religious iconography that had dominated medieval art. The shift toward humanism in the wake of the plague was also reflected in literature. Authors began to explore themes of individualism, personal agency, and the realities of life in a world where death could come at any time. Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the aftermath of the plague, is a prime example of how the Black Death influenced literature. The work, a collection of 100 stories told by a group of young people fleeing the plague in Florence, explores the complexities of human behaviour in the face of death. It captures the turmoil and disillusionment of the time, while also celebrating human resilience and creativity. The cultural transformations brought about by the Black Death weren't limited to art and literature. The plague also had a profound impact on the way people thought about science and the natural world. Before the Black Death, medieval Europeans had little understanding of the nature of disease. People relied on superstitions, religious explanations, and ancient medical theories to explain the causes of illness. But in the wake of the plague, there was a renewed interest in understanding the world through observation, reason, and empirical evidence. The Black Death forced Europeans to confront the limits of medieval medical knowledge. Physicians were unable to stop the spread of the plague, and many of the remedies that were commonly prescribed, such as bloodletting, were ineffective. As a result, the plague became a catalyst for a more scientific approach to medicine. While medieval medicine remained based largely on the ancient theories of Galen and Hippocrates, the plague sparked interest in new approaches, including the study of anatomy and the early foundations of epidemiology. In the centuries following the Black Death, European scientists began to experiment with new methods of observation and experimentation. The works of scholars like Roger Bacon and later Renaissance figures like Leonardo da Vinci contributed to the development of early scientific ideas that would pave the way for the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th centuries. The idea that knowledge could be gained through experimentation and observation began to take hold, challenging the established religious and philosophical views of the time. The intellectual and cultural changes that followed the Black Death also helped to lay the foundation for the Age of Exploration. As Europe's intellectual horizons expanded, there was a growing desire to explore the world beyond the known borders. The renewed focus on individual agency and the curiosity about the natural world spurred explorers like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama to embark on their voyages of discovery. The rise of powerful European nation-states, driven by a new economic system and a thirst for knowledge, set the stage for the global exploration and expansion that would characterize the next several centuries. Thus, while the Black Death brought suffering, devastation, and unimaginable loss, it also set in motion a series of intellectual, cultural, and scientific revolutions that would change the world forever. The survivors of the plague, faced with the realities of mortality and the collapse of old systems, sought meaning and expression in new ways. The humanistic philosophy that emerged in the wake of the plague reshaped the arts, education, and science, setting the stage for the Renaissance and the eventual birth of the modern world. The Black Death did not just cause the destruction of entire communities, it was also a catalyst for rebirth and transformation. From the rubble of medieval society arose the beginnings of the modern era, driven by a renewed focus on the individual, human potential, and the pursuit of knowledge. The survivors of the plague became the builders of a new world, one that would shape the future of Europe and the world. As we continue our exploration of the legacy left by the Black Death, we must now turn our attention to its role in shaping the political landscape of Europe in the centuries following the plague. The social and economic upheaval caused by the plague had far-reaching consequences for the way power was structured, and it led to a reshaping of the political and governmental systems across the continent. The breakdown of feudalism, the rise of centralised monarchies, and the eventual birth of modern states all stemmed in part from the crisis triggered by the Black Death. At the heart of this transformation was the collapse of the feudal system, which had dominated medieval Europe for centuries. Feudalism was based on a rigid hierarchical structure, where kings granted land to nobles, who in turn granted land to vassals, and so on. Peasants, or serfs, were bound to the land, working it in exchange for protection from their lords. This system was relatively stable, but it was also highly dependent on a large labour force to maintain agricultural production and sustain the military forces required for protection. With the massive loss of life caused by the Black Death, the entire foundation of the feudal system was shaken. The death toll among the lower classes, particularly peasants and serfs, was staggering. As a result, the labour force was drastically reduced, and those who survived found themselves in a position of newfound power. With fewer workers available, surviving peasants were able to demand higher wages and better working conditions, creating tensions between the nobility and the lower classes. The growing independence of peasants was not something the nobles could easily control, leading to growing unrest and social conflicts. In some regions, the nobility attempted to restore the old feudal order by passing laws that tried to cap wages and restrict the movement of labourers. However, these laws were largely ineffective, as peasants had more freedom and power than ever before. This shift in the balance of power between the nobility and the peasantry was one of the major contributing factors to the eventual decline of feudalism and the rise of more centralised forms of government. The breakdown of feudalism created an opening for the rise of powerful monarchies, as kings and queens took advantage of the instability to consolidate power. With feudal lords weakened by the plague, many monarchs began to centralise authority in their own hands. This shift in power allowed monarchs to impose taxes, raise standing armies, and create more efficient bureaucracies. As centralisation of power increased, the concept of the modern nation-state began to take shape. Kings and queens, particularly in countries like France, England, and Spain, began to transform their kingdoms into more unified states. The authority of the monarchs was strengthened, and the influence of the feudal aristocracy began to wane. In England, for example, the death of a significant portion of the nobility during the plague allowed the monarchy to establish greater control over the country. The weakening of feudal lords and the rise of a more centralised monarchy also helped pave the way for the English Renaissance, which was marked by the reign of Henry VIII and the flowering of arts and culture during the Tudor dynasty. In France, the devastation caused by the Black Death led to similar political changes. The French monarchy, already powerful before the plague, used the crisis to further consolidate power. The plague's toll on the nobility allowed King Charles V to strengthen royal authority, laying the groundwork for the powerful French state that would emerge in the centuries to come. The expansion of royal power in both England and France was a direct consequence of the weakening of feudal structures, which had been the backbone of medieval society. The political consequences of the Black Death were not limited to Western Europe. In the wake of the plague, other parts of the world also experienced shifts in power. In the Islamic world, for instance, the plague severely impacted the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and the wider Middle East. As with Europe, the devastation caused by the plague led to political instability and a shift in power. In some cases, this instability was exacerbated by the breakdown of trade routes and the weakening of military forces. Despite the widespread political turbulence, the centralisation of power that followed the Black Death ultimately set the stage for the formation of modern nation-states. Monarchs who were able to consolidate power in the aftermath of the plague laid the groundwork for the rise of absolute monarchies in the early modern period. The feudal system that had once dominated Europe was replaced by more centralised and bureaucratic states, where kings and queens held greater authority over their realms. This shift in political power would play a crucial role in shaping the modern political landscape. In addition to the consolidation of political power, the aftermath of the Black Death also saw the rise of new economic systems. As we've discussed, the disruption of trade caused by the plague led to economic stagnation in some regions, but it also created opportunities for new forms of commerce. The labour shortage caused by the death of so many workers gave rise to new forms of industry and commerce, as entrepreneurs sought to capitalise on the rising demand for goods and services. This shift toward a more market-oriented economy was particularly evident in cities, where trade and commerce began to flourish once again. The rise of powerful merchant classes in places like Venice, Florence and Genoa helped to spur economic growth and development. These cities became centres of banking, trade and finance, and the growing wealth of merchant families laid the foundation for the rise of early capitalism. The growth of trade and commerce also contributed to the rise of new political systems. As the merchant class grew in power and influence, they began to demand greater political representation and rights. This shift toward a more commercially driven economy was one of the key factors that led to the development of early capitalist economies in Europe, setting the stage for the rise of modern capitalism in the centuries to come. The consolidation of political power, the rise of centralised monarchies, and the emergence of new economic systems were all part of the larger political transformation that took place in Europe after the Black Death. These changes laid the groundwork for the rise of modern Europe, marked by the creation of nation-states, the development of capitalism, and the emergence of powerful monarchies that would dominate the continent for centuries to come. While the Black Death caused untold suffering, it also acted as a catalyst for political change. The survivors, faced with a shattered world, were forced to rebuild and adapt to new political realities. The emergence of powerful monarchies, the decline of feudalism, and the rise of early capitalist economies were all direct consequences of the upheaval caused by the plague. The survivors of the Black Death may have lived through a time of unimaginable destruction, but they also witnessed the birth of a new political order that would shape the course of European history. As we reach the final chapter of our journey through the Black Death's lasting impact, it's time to step back and reflect on the full scope of its consequences, on humanity, civilization, and the course of history. The plague, which devastated Europe and the broader world, was more than just an apocalyptic event. It was a pivotal moment that reshaped societies, politics, culture, and the human experience in ways that continue to echo through the centuries. From the ashes of destruction, humanity did not just rebuild, it reimagined itself and the world it inhabited. The most immediate consequence of the Black Death was, of course, the loss of life. It is estimated that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population perished in just a few short years. Entire villages were wiped out, and cities saw their populations dwindle. The death toll was staggering, and the psychological trauma for the survivors was profound. People lost family members, friends, and neighbours. They witnessed entire communities disappear. For many, the world they once knew had crumbled in the span of a few years. The concept of death was forever changed, and the survivors were left to grapple with a new reality in which mortality had become a constant presence. Yet from this despair came remarkable resilience. The survivors faced the impossible task of rebuilding their societies and their lives. They were forced to confront the fragility of life, and this realization gave rise to new ways of thinking, acting, and living. In the wake of death, the survivors found opportunities. The plague gave them bargaining power, allowing peasants to demand better wages and conditions. The feudal system, which had long tied people to the land and limited their social mobility, began to break down. In its place, a more dynamic society began to emerge, one that emphasized individual agency and economic opportunity. In this time of upheaval, the survivors looked beyond the physical devastation and began to reimagine their world. One of the most significant transformations was the intellectual and cultural shift that took place. The Black Death led to the questioning of traditional beliefs, including religious dogma, political hierarchies, and the ways in which society was organized. This questioning laid the intellectual foundation for the Renaissance, a period of extraordinary artistic, scientific, and cultural achievement. The humanist philosophy that emerged in the wake of the plague celebrated the potential of individuals to shape their own destinies. It emphasized the importance of reason, education, and the study of the natural world. These ideas sparked a revolution in art, literature, philosophy, and science, one that would reshape the course of history. In art, the Black Death inspired new depictions of the human experience. The constant presence of death led artists to create works that reflected the transient nature of life. The danse macabre became a recurring motif, symbolizing the universality of death and the inevitability of mortality. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo began to explore human emotions and the physical body in ways that had never been done before, bringing a new realism to art. The works of these artists are not just masterpieces of technique, they are reflections of a new understanding of the human condition, shaped by the survivors' experiences with loss and survival. The intellectual climate of the Renaissance was also deeply influenced by the survivors' experiences with the Black Death. As people looked for answers in the wake of the devastation, they turned to ancient texts and philosophies. The rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman knowledge became central to Renaissance humanism, a movement that placed the individual at the heart of intellectual and cultural life. Humanism promoted the idea that humans were capable of reason, creativity, and self-expression. It encouraged a focus on the present world rather than solely on the afterlife, and this shift in perspective helped to birth the modern era. In the sciences, the Black Death also marked a turning point. The medieval understanding of disease was based on ancient theories like the humoral system, which suggested that disease was caused by imbalances in the body's fluids. The plague, however, exposed the limitations of these theories, leading to a greater focus on observation and empirical evidence. While medical knowledge did not advance rapidly immediately following the plague, the Black Death acted as a catalyst for change. In the centuries to follow, medical science would begin to develop more sophisticated methods of diagnosis and treatment. The plague's devastating impact pushed doctors to question old practices and to search for better ways to understand and treat disease. The rise of the modern state was another consequence of the Black Death. The breakdown of feudalism, along with the growing power of monarchs, led to the creation of centralized governments. Monarchs, who had been weakened by the power of the feudal lords, were able to consolidate their authority in the wake of the plague. With fewer nobles to contend with, kings and queens took advantage of the chaos to strengthen their power, laying the groundwork for the modern nation-state. The emergence of strong, centralized monarchies in places like France, England, and Spain helped to stabilize Europe after the plague and set the stage for the rise of European empires in the following centuries. The Black Death's effects on trade and the global economy were also far-reaching. The plague devastated trade routes, disrupted economies, and led to a breakdown in long-distance commerce. However, the global trade networks that had existed before the plague did not disappear entirely. In the years following the pandemic, Europe began to recover economically, and new trade routes were established. The plague also contributed to the rise of early capitalism. The labour shortage caused by the loss of life gave workers more bargaining power, and merchants began to play a larger role in the economy. This shift laid the foundation for the economic systems that would dominate the modern world. While the survivors of the Black Death faced immense challenges, they were also the ones who would shape the future. The plague forced Europe to rebuild, but it also forced a reconsideration of the old ways of thinking. The Renaissance, the rise of centralized monarchies, the growth of trade and commerce, and the emergence of modern science and medicine were all directly or indirectly shaped by the trauma and transformation that followed the Black Death. As we look back on the Black Death, we cannot forget the immense suffering it caused. Millions died, communities were shattered, and societies were forever altered. But we also must recognise the resilience of those who survived. They rebuilt not just their homes, but their entire world. In the wake of devastation, they found the strength to create a new era, one that would ultimately lead to the modern world. The Black Death may have been one of the darkest moments in human history, but it also sparked one of the most remarkable periods of transformation. The survivors, though deeply scarred by the loss of life and the collapse of the old world, became the architects of a new future. From the depths of despair, they forged a new understanding of humanity, the world, and the possibilities of the future. In the end, the Black Death was not just a story of death and destruction. It was a story of survival, adaptation, and rebirth. It showed the resilience of the human spirit and how even in the face of unimaginable tragedy, people have the capacity to rebuild, transform, and redefine their world.